I'm Dom Nicholls and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today we report on the details of the latest Coalition of the Willing summit in Paris, asking how significant was the strong US presence and input. We get an update from Francis in Hungary, and later we have an interview with Sir Ben Wallace, Britain's former Defence Secretary, who says it's just wishful thinking that Donald Trump would put any weight behind a backstop because Putin knows, in Sir Ben's words, that he's got a guy in the White House aligned to Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 7th of January, 3 years and 319 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by my Telegraph colleagues Venetia, Rainey and Francis Dearnley. I started by introducing the main points from last night's Paris Declaration. So as expected, yesterday's Coalition of the Willing summit in Paris confirmed that Britain and France will deploy troops into Ukraine as part of any future ceasefire deal. The biggest news from yesterday evening was that the plan is supposed to be backed for the first time by the United States. The statement issued at the end of another hectic day of diplomacy said, quote, US capabilities such as intelligence and logistics would be part of the land, air and sea force. But it's not yet clear how the US would respond if the coalition came under attack in Ukraine. Now, referring to the position of the United States, one European diplomatic source told our colleague Joe Barnes, further involvement is also on the table. Of course, it's theirs to fulfil at a moment of their choosing. So not absolutely cast iron, I would suggest. Now, before I turn to the military updates, let's hear more of the detail from last night in Paris from Venetia and the much vaunted deal that Russia, of course, has had no part in developing. On the contrary, Russia has signalled very strongly they would object to any Western boots on the ground. They are likely to want to reject the Paris Declaration in its entirety, but they have to walk that diplomatic tightrope of being seen to so obviously reject something in the eyes of Donald Trump. But Venetia, what caught your eye about the Paris Declaration?
OK, so you've given us the headlines there. Let's go into some of the details. So yesterday saw French President Emmanuel Macron host talks in Paris with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and more than 30 other world leaders that make up the Coalition of the Willing, from Poland to Canada to Australia. And there were two other crucial guests there, Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. Marco Rubio had been due to attend the talks, but he pulled out after Trump's Venezuela attack. And a side note, Jared Kushner's dad, Charles Kushner, was also there in the big Coalition of the Willing happy family photo in his role as US ambassador to France and Monaco. Shall we say interesting appointment from last year that I missed.
Bring your dad to work, David.
Well, he is the US ambassador to France, but yes, something like that. So lots of glad-handing, hugs, kisses, mingling, and then everyone disappears into a room for 5 hours. They re-emerge with really big smiles to announce a joint declaration for a multinational force to help uphold any peace agreement. So let's get into the details. What exactly is it? It's a declaration of intent. It's being called the Paris Declaration, and it essentially paves a legal pathway for British and French forces to operate on Ukrainian soil and police its skies and seas. Keir Starmer described it as a legally binding commitment to support Ukraine in case of a future armed attack. Who signed it? Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Volodymyr Zelensky. Only those three leaders for this agreement. Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Poland's Donald Tusk said after the talks that their nations would not contribute troops to any mission in Ukraine. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said German troops would contribute to a force, but only one based in neighbouring countries, not inside Ukraine. It's also not been explicitly endorsed by the United States, and details of a US role were watered down from an earlier draft, according to reports. Witkoff and Kushner did express their vocal support for it, though, and we'll come on to that in more detail in just a minute. So what does this Paris Declaration say? Well, it outlines the future deployment of forces on the ground, in the air and at sea as part of a wider European-led multinational force. The plan includes Britain and France setting up military hubs in Ukraine to facilitate troop deployments if needed, and also to help with reconstruction efforts. This is from Starmer's readout. The multinational force for Ukraine will act as a reassurance force to bolster security guarantees and Ukraine's ability to return to peace and stability by supporting the regeneration of Ukraine's own forces. Alongside our plans for a coordination cell post-ceasefire, the UK and France will also establish military hubs across Ukraine to enable the deployment and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs. The agreement also calls for European fighter jets and surveillance aircraft to be used to police the skies above Ukraine to enable the resumption of international air travel. However, Macron made it clear that the goal of the force is to provide reassurance after the ceasefire, which obviously we don't have any agreement on yet, and noted it would be stationed a long way behind the contact line, and that's a direct quote. No further clarity on the size or scope of the potential force, and we should also add that Turkey and other Black Sea nations will lead a mission to demine the waters and secure key shipping routes. So what about the US? Obviously crucial in all of this. Well, as Dom mentioned, the big headline here is that they have agreed for the first time to what Merz referred to as a backstop to support the force in case of attack. That's according to the statement signed at the end of the day. Witkoff didn't share any specifics. He said the US military have been thinking about it when he was asked about the backstop. The agreement also includes a ceasefire monitoring system led by the US. This is really crucial, and this is quite concrete. Washington will use drones, satellites and sensors to adjudicate any potential breaches. Reading from the joint statement again, there will be a continuous, reliable ceasefire monitoring system. This will be led by the US with international participation, including contributions from members of the Coalition of the Willing. Now, as part of yesterday's diplomatic jamboree, Witkoff and Kushner held quite a rare joint press conference to share their thoughts. I'm going to share some of their quotes here. Kushner called the deal over security guarantees a very, very big milestone. But he warned, this does not mean that we will make peace, but peace would not be possible without the progress that was made here today. Witkoff went into a bit more detail. He said, the president strongly stands behind security protocols. Those security protocols are meant to A, deter any attacks in Ukraine, and B, if there are any attacks, they are meant to defend, and they will do both. They are as strong as anyone has ever seen. The president does not back down from his commitments. He is strong for the country of Ukraine and for a peace deal, and we will be there for the Ukrainians in helping them to get to that final peace. We are determined on his behalf to do everything possible to obtain that peace. We think we're largely finished with security protocols, but we also think, critically, we are very, very close to finishing up as robust a prosperity agreement as any country has ever seen coming out of conflicts like this. And Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation were due to meet separately with Witkoff and Kushner yesterday evening to further discuss a bilateral peace agreement. No further details on that, although Zelensky did flag in advance that, of course, Ukraine giving up territory remains a key sticking point. I'll pass back over to Dom to analyse some of that.
Yes, thanks, Venetia. So I was watching this last night. I think the way it's framed as a deal, I think it's the wrong word. It's good. I think Mr. Kushner is correct there when he says it's a big milestone. I think deal is the wrong way to think about it. It was more kind of codifying existing policy positions and diplomatic language. There was more detail, clearly, the stuff about Turkey and other Black Sea nations being responsible for demining the Black Sea. That we hadn't heard that before. So there's a little bit more detail, but not a huge amount. And as I say, it wasn't a deal because they're all pals anyway, and they've spoken about this. I see Megan Mobb's reaction has been, she says, unless it's a treaty, this will not matter. Congress can approve agreements by simple majority, and they are effectively worthless. She says a treaty requires 2/3 in the Senate for ratification to make them binding. OK, now crucially, and for me most importantly, the US were there, and they were active and they were energetic. Mr. Kushner, Mr. Witkoff. I didn't know Mr. Kushner's dad was in. I don't know how energetic he was. Anyway. Now, they took part in the joint press conference at the end, which was significant. So the press conference, there was Macron, Zelensky, Friedrich Merz, Keir Starmer, and then a podium for Kushner and Witkoff. So, they are there, they are fronting it up. They didn't just turn up and then hide in the background. So I think that is significant. There are questions, many, many questions about this US backstop, what it consists of and where will it be based. So what's the response time to react in the event of any ceasefire violation, i.e. how far back is the backstop going to be and what could it stop? Are we talking actual American boots on the ground, getting into a shooting war with Russia in the event of a ceasefire violation, potentially? Or just a bit more satellite and drone monitoring, promises of sanctions, that kind of thing. So no real detail about the backstop. Notably, like I said, the US were there in force. General Grinkovich, who's SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who's also, this is General Grinkovich, US Air Force General, he's also the head of US forces in Europe. He was very prominent. He's been hailed as crucial in convincing his political bosses in Washington to back this potential deployment by the coalition. But so aside from headlines of the actual signing of the declaration, which, as I said, I don't really think shifts the dial that much, there were a couple of things that stuck out for me in that rare joint press conference. So Friedrich Merz said, after a ceasefire, Germany will accept responsibility for security of Ukraine and for the continent as a whole. I really sat up at that point. Now, this was going through a translator, so maybe there is a little bit of nuance lost in translation, because those are two pretty big statements by Mr. Merz. Now, Germany's investing heavily in defence, but to say after a ceasefire, Germany will accept responsibility for security of Ukraine and for the continent as a whole is a biggie. So, we'll look for more detail on that. And then a slightly strange, a great piece of detail from Steve Witkoff, talking about the huge US investment firm BlackRock. He said, "We are working with BlackRock on the project of the future of Ukraine. Its goal is to create conditions under which people returning after the war will be able to find work in their homeland. We consider this project extremely important for the Ukrainian people." I mean, yeah, good stuff. A bit odd to go down to the specifics of which firm and what does it say if you're already talking to BlackRock about future economic and business opportunities in the country. He also said, this is Steve Witkoff, he also said land options will be the most crucial issue. We'll come up with certain compromises on that. That really is the nub of the whole thing, the whole land and compromises. That's the nub of it all. We've been speaking about it at length recently, and yesterday took neither of those issues any further forward because Russia was not there. Okay, so that's why I say we're not any really much further forward. But I did think it was symbolic that the Witkoff Kushner turning up to the press conference, showing that they're there, they're backing the plan, they weren't hiding away. There was a question about what value any agreement with the US has given Greenland. That was pretty effectively dodged by the US delegation. So I think overall we should be cautious to judge anything that comes out of this. I don't think it's a breakthrough. There's still no obvious way ahead, no real extra pressure on Putin. But just by doing this, it adds to the political momentum, and that does have a value. In my interview with Ben Wallace, you can hear later, I asked Ben Wallace how much political room Russia now has to outright reject this Paris declaration. I did ask Britain's former Defence Secretary a few questions directly about Ukraine and this backstop, and Ben Wallace said it's wishful thinking that Trump's going to put any weight behind a backstop. He's shown after, I think, 9 or 10 times threatening Russia, he's never done it. He's never imposed any of his ultimatums on Russia. I then said, if you were Defence Secretary today, would you trust the word of this US administration? And he said, not at all. He then went on to say, I think Putin knows that he's effectively, successfully got a guy in the White House that is aligned to him. I also asked him about Greenland and Venezuela. He said he was in favour of the action of rendition. This was not specifically about Maduro, but obviously in the context of Maduro. Ben Wallace said he's a bit hawkish. He's a bit vulture on the whole thing. He's in favour of rendition. He will explain why if you listen later on. We also talked about defence disinvestment by Europe, adding to the whole Greenland spat at the moment. Ben Wallace said, ultimately, overall, we, as Europe, we have neglected our missions, promised things to NATO for 30 years that we haven't delivered. So more on all that later on. But now, delighted to chat again to Franco. Franco, you've been on the road for a few days. Come in, Francis. Talk to us. What's your reaction to Paris? And give us a quick update on what you've been up to since that press conference you're in with Viktor Orban. Feels a long time ago now, but Monday. Come in, Francis. London calling.
Well, this is Budapest calling. Hi, Dom. Hi, Venetia. I'm currently, you'll love this, in a graveyard of Soviet statues in the centre of the city. I must bring Kaya Kallas here on a date. She'd love it. It's coated with snow, so much so that Lenin, who I'm currently standing here looking at in the cold, has a white beard. It's a historian's dream, frankly. But more on that another time, and I'll come to what I've been up to in Hungary in a moment. I think My reaction to the events in Paris yesterday is I return to a common theme for us on the podcast, really, which is this key question. Will this incentivize or disincentivize Russia to negotiate? And I fear that by talking about what it will mean for Russia if they sign a peace deal or a ceasefire, then they all think, well, why on earth would we want to stop fighting? Because it means that effectively our maximist objectives for Ukraine are off the table. Strategically, is this really wise in terms of thinking about how serious it would be for Moscow? And in that vein, one could argue that really this is Europe trying to insert itself into a conversation that's in danger of taking place over their heads. Now, that's not to say that it isn't still valuable if that is the case. The US aspect that you were just talking about, Dom, I think is significant and, of course, welcome, because if at the end of all of this, Moscow just rejects it outright, then that's not going to play very well among Witkoff or Kushner, and certainly not Donald Trump. And that may well matter as we move into the next phase of the war in 2026. It is worth bearing in mind, I think, just how severe before the full-scale invasion Moscow's demands were in relation not only to Ukraine, but to NATO. Of course, I am in Hungary at the moment, and lest we forget that in December 2021, the attitude was from the Russians, and the demands put forward on the table to stop any full-scale invasion was that NATO forces needed to be withdrawn, not only the prospect of it, withdrawn from Ukraine, but withdrawn from countries like Hungary. They were talking about NATO expansion. Now, what you could say is it's being put forward on the table in Paris now is essentially putting forward NATO forces, I know not under that umbrella, but NATO forces in Ukraine. That is a defeat for Moscow. So realistically, is that something that they are going to be willing to accept? I highly, highly doubt it. And I know we're talking about Venezuela. I just think it is important to underscore here that that success is likely to embolden Donald Trump in various different theaters. And I think we have to be very, very sensitive to what may occur with Greenland over the coming weeks and months. Now, Greenland may not have been on the table if Venezuela had not been such a success, but as we see from history time and time again, when leaders as strong as Donald Trump at the moment have a success like that, they're more likely to take bold action. So we should be under no doubt if Greenland is attacked or taken or really forcibly negotiated to be given to the United States, which is certainly not going to happen given that joint statement from Greenland, Denmark, Britain, all of those countries that you were talking about, then all of these conversations would be off the table. NATO would arguably be dead. So it's very important, I think, just to remember that in the context of all of this. So those are a few instant reactions in the cold, Dom. I'm currently walking up and down and I'm being eyed by Karl Marx. So it's not as as eloquent as I might like. But you asked me what I've been up to in Hungary. I mean, very, very briefly, been meeting with quite a lot of senior officials here after the Prime Minister. I had a robust exchange of views, as one can imagine, with the Deputy Defence Minister. And today I'm actually recording some content relevant to what happens if Orban loses in April, because of course Hungary and its role in blocking sanctions packages and just generally causing a nuisance from the perspective of Brussels, if that is off the table, if there is an opposition elected which is far more favourable to Brussels, or at least slightly warmer in its relations, then that could well change the calculus in this part of Europe. And that has implications for Ukraine, and it has implications for all of us. But yeah, it's a very interesting place to finally get a little bit of a deeper dive on. And I look forward to talking about it in future episodes with you. But that's all from me in very cold, snowy, but beautiful Budapest for now.
Thanks, Francis. Just looking here, Venetia's just pulled up the polling data that says, albeit it's from December the 20th, a little bit out. This is a Politico, so a good source, but the polling data is from December the 20th, saying that Orban's Fidesz party is sitting on 37% at the moment, opposition Tisza are on 49%. Is that the kind of feel you get from chatting through all the nightclubs and vodka bars that you've been in?
Well, it feels very close. That's how I would put it. Orban's party are trying to define this as existential for Hungary's future, and they're trying to portray the opposition as being very close and cosy with Brussels and being warmongers in essence. And the language that's used is very strong indeed. But I think even the government here, who've been in charge for 15 years, lest we forget, it's a long, long time, acknowledge that it is a long time, and that governments that are in power for a long time in a democracy do sometimes just tend to be voted out of office, even if opinion polls are quite favourable towards them and their policies. So I think they are very sensitive to the fact that they might well lose this election. And some of the things that they've been talking about, what they would do in that case, I think speak to the fact that there is a very real prospect. But it's too early to say. And there has been a little bit of a bounce in the polls for Viktor Orban in the last few weeks. Again, relevant to the Ukraine issue is the fact that Mr. Orban wanted to see Donald Trump come here. They wanted to see the peace negotiations taking place here where I am now in Budapest, seeing Putin and Trump shaking hands over a table, maybe Zelensky, with Viktor Orban in the background as the key broker. That would be very, very helpful for him indeed, given the election coming up. So also worth bearing in mind this at the moment. But I've got a lot of thoughts to offer on the situation here in the country. There's a lot of different angles that one can explore. But as I say, one for another time when I finished my tour of this fascinating historical site with Soviet statues and when I've had a cup of tea.
Brilliant. Thanks, Francis. I can tell you that we can't wait to hear all your thoughts. Now, we'll speak to you in the next few days. Do keep warm. Keep stamping the feet. I'll carry on with the military updates now, and then we'll have more diplomatic updates from Venetia shortly. So last night, 81 of 95 Russian drones got through Ukrainian air defence. An Iskander-M ballistic missile was also fired. That was intercepted. However, 14 of those strike drones did get through. It hit 8 locations. Dnipro was hit, 5 schools and kindergartens damaged there. Residential areas of Kramatorsk also hit, and hospitals in Lviv in the west experienced power outages. One of the reasons for this potentially increased rate of interception is that, Ukraine's MOD put out a report saying it's now supplying over 1,500 interceptor drones a day. This was data from December. Now that can only help. It's mainly against the Shahed, which is low and slow, but it's good that these interceptor drones are getting through now in their numbers, in the quantities. Now, another report, the Stary Oskol oil depot in Russia's Belgorod Oblast was hit last night by Ukrainian drones. Belgorod Oblast, that borders Ukraine, borders the Sumy, Kharkiv and Luhansk Oblast in the northeast of the country. Now, the Russian opposition news channel Astra says that local residents reported a fire outside the city late last night, and they said a local oil depot was burning. Local Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov, he confirmed a drone had attacked the oil storage facility and said as a result of the detonation, several tanks caught fire on the site. He later said firefighters had extinguished the blaze, no casualties. Now, this comes after Ukraine's general staff confirmed a long-range strike on Russia's 100th arsenal of their main missile and artillery directorate. This was near the town of Nea in the Kostroma region. That's about 500 km northeast of Moscow, 900 kilometers from the nearest bit of Ukrainian land, to put it in perspective. This strike, I think, occurred overnight Monday, Tuesday, just being reported late last night. The General Staff said the facility functions as a hub of accounting, maintenance, storage and preparation for shipment of artillery ammunition, as well as operational tactical level missiles. Now, a source in the Security Service for Ukraine, the SBU, speaking to the Kyiv Independent, said long-range drones operated by the agency's Alpha branch had carried out the attack, claiming the explosions from secondary detonations had rung out all night. You'll remember the head of the SBU has just been, moved on from post, and the head of the Alpha branch, Alpha unit, is stepping up. SBU Alpha is going to be the new head there. A couple more for me. There's a story in Azeri Times, Azerbaijan, saying that Russia now refuses to take responsibility for the downing of Azerbaijan Airlines flight J28243, despite Putin publicly admitting in October 2025 that Russian air defences had shot the plane down. They've closed the criminal case now, blaming weather conditions. So the text of a letter from Alexander Pastrykin, who's the chairman of Russia's investigative committee, sent to Azerbaijan's prosecutor general, this was reported in the Azeri Times, says it has been established that the aircraft departed at 6:55 Moscow time from Baku Airport to Grozny Airport due to weather conditions, brackets cloudiness. After 2 unsuccessful attempts, the crew was unable to land at Grozny Airport, made a decision to proceed to another airport, and during the approach to landing at Aktau Airport at approximately 9:28 Moscow time, collided with the ground, resulting in the destruction of the aircraft and fire, as a result of which 38 people died and 29 received injuries of varying severity. Based on the results of the investigation and on the basis of the totality of the evidence obtained, the criminal case has been terminated. However, later in the letter, it said a comprehensive aviation technical forensic examination has been appointed. It is planned to give an additional assessment of the circumstances of the aircraft crash. So all a bit odd. Putin's accepted responsibility, saying that his air defenders made a mistake. They said they thought they were trying to shoot down a Ukrainian drone or an aircraft or something, but they brought down this airliner. Well, they're now saying that it was because of cloud or that the aircraft impacted the ground. No mention of air defence whatsoever. And I think this comprehensive aviation technical forensic examination is going to say something like the aircraft was serviceable and flight surfaces and systems were operational up to the point that it flew into the ground because of the cloudiness. So I don't think they're going to suddenly turn around and say, oh yeah, there was a massive explosion from an air defence missile. So all a little bit odd, but not going down well in Azerbaijan. And then just last one for me, speaking after attending the Coalition of the Willing Summit in Paris yesterday, Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, Andrej Babiš, said that the Czech-led initiative supplying Ukraine with artillery ammunition will continue. You'll remember that this has been in doubt since he took power last year, basically. He's always been cool on support for Ukraine and had campaigned to end this ammunition initiative. So he's going to carry on. However, he said the Czech Republic would henceforth only be a coordinator of the project. Mr. Babiš said, I've decided, even after consulting with coalition partners, that we will not disrupt the ammunition initiative. The project will continue and the Czech Republic will be in the role of coordinator. No money from Czech citizens will be invested in the ammunition initiative. So, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I guess, or the other way around. Anyway, Venetia, other diplomatic updates. What's caught your eye?
Well, just 2 other small things. Just on the back of that Czechia update, it's worth flagging quickly that Petr Masinka, Czechia's new foreign minister, has announced that he will visit Ukraine in the near future, according to local media. This is important because it comes off the back of a controversy caused by the Czech Parliament chairman's New Year's address. Tomio Okamura said at the time, we must not give away our citizens' money to foreign nationals simply because military propaganda demands it, adding that Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine was an absolutely senseless war. Ukraine's ambassador to Czechia responded by calling his statement unworthy and absolutely unacceptable. Since then, Ukraine and Czechia's foreign ministers have spoken by phone and they've resolved the matter. And this is important because since the outset of Russia's full-scale invasion, Czechia has stood out as one of Ukraine's most dependable allies, according to the Kyiv Independent. The tiny Central European country has provided heavy weapons, including tanks, MLRS systems and helicopters, and it's welcomed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. However, the Kyiv Independent writes that Czech politics has seen a rise in populist rhetoric over the past few months. The ANO party, which opposes Ukraine's membership in the EU and has vowed to halt support for Kyiv in the Czech state budget, won in the country's parliamentary elections last October, so one to keep an eye on. And just finally, Cyprus has assumed the EU's rotating 6-month presidency today. It started its term with a meeting attended by Zelensky, among others. Zelensky was welcomed at the presidential palace by the Cypriot president Nicholls Christodoulides. He told the president, we hope that during your presidency, a lot of steps can be taken forward closer to membership in the EU. We'll see if that comes to fruition.
Along with other senior government positions, Sir Ben Wallace was Britain's Defence Secretary between 2019 and 2023. He led the last in-person diplomatic effort to Moscow just ahead of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. In a wide-ranging interview, I started by asking him about the Paris Declaration, the US backstop, before moving on to Venezuela, Greenland, rendition, and the general disinvestment in defence by European nations in the last, few years. Here is our conversation. So I'm joined now by Sir Ben Wallace, former British Defence Secretary. Sir Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. Last night, the Paris Declaration, a little bit more detail, but actually not a huge difference from what we already know about existing policy permissions, except for comments about the US support, about this backstop and so on. Do you agree with that? And indeed, what shape do you think any US backstop needs to be? And did you hear that coming from the US delegation in Paris?
Well, I think it was a little bit of a nudge, let's say, further than we knew previously. Some of the commitments Britain has already been doing, Operation Orbital, as you and I know, we were on the ground with the Swedes, with the Canadians, helping Ukraine post-2014, having British troops there, not a rare thing. I mean, Russia has managed to recast the information environment to make out that somehow foreign troops were there in secret. I remember when I went to the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, they told me about 16 Air Assault Brigade. Shock, horror, had been in Ukraine. And I noticed the documents he was reading had a front page of the Sun or the Express. That was the extent of the KGB intelligence, which some of those things we've already been doing, right? For some of us, it's not a new thing. Also, it's up to Ukraine who it wants in its territory. It's not up to Russia or anyone else. I think what's still missing is really the backstop. I mean, it's wishful thinking that Trump's are going to put any weight behind a backstop. He's shown after, I think, 9 or 10 times threatening Russia. He's never done it. He's never imposed any of his ultimatums on Russia. And, there's a lot of detail to be done. I mean, what people forget about deployment of troops is one of the most important decisions is the rules of engagement, right? It might seem sort of like minutiae, but ultimately it is the extent to which your troops are allowed to defend themselves, defend their mission, and indeed defend, in this example, Ukraine. And who are they going to attack if they are attacked? For example, Russia, if we know in the Balkans War, you look how the Serbs behaved, militia, unorthodox individuals, little green men, as we remember in Crimea in 2014. What happens when those people attack our forces? Are they Russian? I mean, you and I might know they're Russian. Are we allowed to properly stop them doing it again? Or will it be that they just snipe across the border? And Russia's track record of that is they killed 18,000 Ukrainians from 2014 to the invasion. So I think there's a lot of detail to still be done. And then, of course, the other detail is who is going to deploy? How long can we afford to deploy our troops? What does it mean for our Estonia deployment? What does it mean for everything else? This current government has a track record of spinning and repackaging, pretending it's something new. I suspect the government's only real option is to use the forces it's currently deploys to Estonia. That's it, right? And it can't even do that properly because it hasn't got the logistical support, the cover, the air cover, the long-range fire covers that it needs.
So just back onto the US side, though, if you were Defense Secretary today, would you trust the word of this US administration?
Not at all.
A clear answer. Now, the Paris Declaration last night, lots of talk, 40 representatives, I think 27 countries, then institutions like NATO, European Union. Interestingly, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, US General Grinkovich was there. So other entities, 40 leaders in all. Very easy to come up with a declaration, which I said I think largely was marking the homework that's already been stated. Very easy for Russia to reject it. They obviously had no part in the declaration last night. But for the political momentum and Russia's desperate desire not to upset Donald Trump, how much political room do you think Russia now has to reject this Paris Declaration? And how will, or perhaps how should, the coalition of the willing have prepared for a Russian rejection?
Well, on the first part, I think Russia will just reject it in the same way it's rejected consistently a number of ultimatums or indeed offers. What they'll do is Putin will get on the phone again to President Trump, talk to him for 2 hours. Trump usually then repeats all the Moscow talking points, I've noticed. At the same time, Lavrov will come out and say, to be fair to them, what they have been consistent about even before the invasion, that they will not tolerate any NATO troops or European troops in Ukraine. And also, when they talk about a ceasefire, all of this is dependent on more than just a ceasefire. The wording of the declaration talks about once a ceasefire, but there's actually more than that. It's not just about stopping the guns right now. There's territory, right? I mean, Russia have never changed their position, to be honest. And they do that because they know Donald Trump backs down. He backs down all the time. Russia still, by the way, doesn't have any trade tariffs on it. It's about one of the few countries in the world that doesn't. So I think what Putin will see is that this week, President Trump finally moved in line with the national security strategy to a leadership of spheres of influence, not rule of law, not the last 70 years of American foreign policy. He's gone to a world of spheres of influence. That aligns him with Putin and President Xi in how to do business. And if you read or heard some of the statements from the State Department, I think yesterday on Venezuela, where they were actually even being more hardline about anything in our spheres of influence we will not tolerate, I think Putin knows he's effectively, successfully got a guy in the White House that is aligned to them. And it's clear that Trump believes Ukraine is the sphere of influence of Russia. That's the reality of it. So I think on that side, I think Putin will feel no obligation to comply with it or to bend the knee to it or compromise on it, which will probably scupper it. I think there were drone attacks last night. Didn't sound like a ceasefire to me. And then on the other bit about what could we do about it, Britain and France and those other nations could put troops in. We could do it for a short period of time. It would come at the expense of something else. And what formation would it be? That's why it goes back to the point about rules of engagement. The rules of engagement would then define the type of formations. If it's a UN blueberry operation, it's small arms and policing type patrols that, as we saw in the Balkans, made us look impotent. If it was a proper, robust security guarantee deployment, it should be something like the Ark, right? Which is funny enough, a fighting corps without US, almost no US contributions in the Ark.
The Allied Rapid Reaction Corps.
Yeah, which is based in Gloucester, got a British commander. You could lift and shift that tomorrow morning if you wanted to. I mean, the reality is we couldn't, because none of us have actually been spending our money on our enablers and our capabilities. It's one of the hollowed out formations. That would send a message to Putin that this thing can defend itself.
Now, you mentioned business a moment ago. I thought it was very interesting that Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy, talked about BlackRock, the enormous US investment firm. Last night in the press conference, he said, "We are working with BlackRock on the project of the future of Ukraine." What was your reaction when you heard an investment firm referenced in some sort of post-ceasefire reconstruction of Ukraine?
Well, it comes on the same day American oil companies were called, I think, to the White House or to the American administration to discuss taking oil from Venezuela at a price set by Donald Trump. It comes about, a few months after the so-called mineral extortion deal, where Trump extorted Zelensky for mineral rights. There's no secret here, There was numerous people, Rubio and others, very clear that Venezuela is about oil. That was on Air Force One. Even Senator Graham kept talking about it. So I think the reality is we know what this is about. And in President Trump's mind, any political capital he has to burn with Russia, he can pay off by saying to his own people, but don't worry, I got some dollars in return. That's the simple reality of it. Greenland, for example, where there is already an American base, right? I mean, it's not like Greenland is hostile. There's an American base. There are numerous constant NATO operations around Greenland because, as you and I know, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap is the key choke point into the Atlantic that both China and Russia have to pass through should they wish to come into our area of responsibilities. So it's not about that. It's about the minerals and the oil and the gas that's sitting somewhere near Greenland. I mean, that's what spheres of influence seem to be about.
You mentioned Greenland. British former General Sir Richard Shirreff, a former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he said this morning that the US has a point that Europe has neglected the military capabilities required in and around Greenland to face the Chinese and Russian threat. Do you agree with that? And during your tenure, why was Europe so reluctant to rebuild their militaries more broadly that have been hollowed out by years of underinvestment?
I would agree with Richard Shirreff to one extent. What I would actually say, it was 360 what we didn't invest in. It wasn't just that. Our high north capability. I did the very first Arctic strategy in my time, and I held it off for over a year until we actually had something solid to put in it. It was just a talking document when I inherited it. All round, we disinvested in the enablers that allow us to get to the front line of the Eastern Europe. So people used to boast about a deployable division. I remember getting told off by Number 10 for publicly saying we can't deploy a division. It's a complete fantasy. We might have some of the frontline equipment, but we don't have the low loaders and the enablers and the things. So I think what I would say is he's right, but you can say that about any one of our missions that we should be able to deploy and uphold. We have a 16-area assault brigade, but we don't really have the ability to deploy them in a one-er. So I think that's just another symptom of the hollowing out. What I would say is, funnily enough, the part of the areas that we did invest in are those very capabilities to cover that gap. We knew how important that is for both our deterrence and indeed Russian threat. The P-8 that we bought, the P-8 Maritime Patrol aircraft, the amazing Boeing aircraft that we use, we bought 8 of those, I think it was. I commissioned RAF Proteus, the first ship of its kind to protect our cables. In the sonar nets under the sea, the sensitive sniffers or listeners that we have, Huge amounts of investment go into that. That's usually a joint American-British program. I did all of that. So actually, he's slightly wrong that in that part, we neglected that, because that was the one area you could argue we carried on with our attack submarines, etc. But ultimately, overall, we have neglected our missions. We've promised things to NATO for 30 years that we haven't delivered.
Now, you mentioned Venezuela as well. If I could just ask you about that. I got in a bit of hot water the other day I've got some support and criticism for saying, in the absence of an overarching world government, I go back to the responsibility to protect argument and saying I would like people to act in good faith as and when they can. And if that involves preemptive military force, then so be it. I outlined the argument of necessity, proportionality and imminent threat and said, on balance, reluctantly, and see what comes next, I would not condemn the US action in Venezuela. I was going on the lines of, if you break it, you own it. And it looks like the US is not really going to do much other than literally try to own Venezuela. So it was a very reluctant position I took. But where do you stand on this idea that international law has been broken and we should all just hope that baddies go away?
Well, I think there's two parts to the Venezuelan operation. One part I understand, and I'm not particularly enamored where current international law sits, which is this inability to render people back for trial to a country that has an independent judiciary. And, I faced constant problems in my time as Defense Secretary where there were people I wanted to bring back for trial. For example, the Beatles, the men that had murdered British citizens and many other in the name of ISIS, beheading and everything else. And when they were detained, I want them to come back here, be on trial, so justice can be seen to be done. And also, I wanted all their digital intelligence. I want to be able to track down more bad guys. But currently, as European Convention law, and indeed probably domestic UK law, sits, how you get to a court is as important as the trial itself. And I think that is very, very foolish. In fact, one of the first columns I did on leaving office was, this is a problem for us. It doesn't reflect today's communications and the world we live in. If there is a state that refuses to comply with handing over someone planning to blow up, let's say, Britain's stock exchange, there is only one way you can deal with that imminent threat currently under the European Convention on Human Rights is kill the person. You can't go in with an SAS squad and snatch them and bring them home for trial. You can't in a failed state like Syria do that, right? It's bizarre. So on that bit, the United States had indicted Maduro. They have to place before a court the evidence of why he was indicted. And if it was as they say it was, then he posed a threat to thousands of Americans through corporate drug smuggling, whole-scale relationships with cartels that murder thousands of people. And that's for the United States to do. They have a long tradition of viewing rendition as it gets called or as legitimate. That's probably back to their history where, the US Marshal had to go and use bounty hunters to get someone from Texas. But ultimately, I'm not going to lose sleep on that bit. The bit I do think is very worrying and a very dangerous precedent, because it is what Putin believes and she believes, is that I'm going to run your country for you, right? I mean, I don't quite agree with if it's broke, you own it. Ultimately, the United States removed a leader of a sovereign country and brought him back for trial. Fine. But you've got to think through the second and third order consequences. And we know the Trump administration never does, right? So at the moment, his deputy is now running the country. What happens when American oil and gas engineers take over the refinery and get killed by a small terrorist group who doesn't like it? Is he going to invade Venezuela? Imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine if Russia swept into a country, took over its oil and gas. America would probably sanction anyone that buys that oil and gas, right? I mean, that's what happens at the time. Imagine if Iran, let's swept in and captured Qatar tomorrow. You can see it from the coastline, and then started dishing out its gas. America, Britain, Europe would sanction that gas. It would sanction whoever buys it. So I think that's the bit I worry most about, because that's exactly what Putin feels is his justification for invading Ukraine.
Yeah. The day two is the justification. So just finally, throughout this chat, the three areas of consistency if I may, that you've identified. Number one, Putin, consistent. He's done what he said. What he said he will do for the last 20 odd years. Donald Trump, consistent again, and very consistent in line with the US national security strategy of last November, and consistent that Europe still doesn't really want to recognise the threat. The further north and the further east you go in Europe, perhaps yes, but Britain, France, Germany, not really. Have you got any good news? And in the light of all that, how do you think the next NATO summit in Turkey is going to go?
Well, I'm not sure I do have any good news, I'm afraid to tell you. It's also another example of a bit of a failed function of our Foreign Office. You know, we've had an embassy in Caracas, right? This Venezuelan operation was in planning for 7 months, right? 7 months they're planning this. And allegedly we didn't know in any way. So that's a pretty much a failing just for our early warning and our antennae capability. The coalition of the willing is another spin. You know, 2 of those 3 major powers have met in Paris, Britain and France, aren't spending any extra money on defence. Only Germany is. There we go. It's the coalition of the unwilling to fund, really. And until that changes, Putin isn't going to listen to us. Why should he, right? Europeans have been consistently putting social policy before spending on their security and defence, and have done for 30 odd years. We're still spending more money on the NHS, more money on benefits, more money on public transport, bicycle lanes and all sorts of other stuff, and expecting America or someone else to pick up the tab. So the only optimism I have is Europe still has some of the richest consumers on earth. We still are a market that people want to come to. There are still huge amounts of skilled workforce in these countries, including our own, that if we put our mind to it, we could generate strength through economic power again, strength through military capability again. If we put our mind to it, if we get rid of Rachel Reeves, I now work in finance as much as I work in defence, and we have a huge opportunity in London to become a centre of all those people and investors who are really quite worried about America, worried about the Donald Trump precedent. Lots of Americans worried about Donald Trump precedent, you know, who is going to be his next Fed chief. And actually, we would be incredibly attractive for those countries, those investors who want to have a foot in America, a foot in Europe, a foot around the world. Unfortunately, we have a chancellor who is determined to drive out of this country anyone that's going to contribute to our economic might or power. So we're just going to remain viewed as being weak by Russia and America.
And so we are back into the world of spheres of influence. And is this going to be the last NATO summit?
No, again, what I found always through this whole process being rather odd is because people don't want to believe the Putin view of the world or the Trump view, that they're bad as they are, we just waffle and talk around things. Once the penny drops, we all have that capability to step up to the plate. You know, if Britain had followed Germany and Nordics and Poland, by now we could have a formidable military capability or on track. That means, yes, it would be horrendous if America left NATO. And I don't want America to leave NATO. But if America under Trump's administration chose to leave NATO, we have a chance of catching up some of the gap, right? You can't do it overnight, but you're definitely not going to do it if you're not spending any money and you haven't got a pathway to 3.5%. Poland has, Germany has, the Nordics have. So if we want to do this, we could do it. If we want to have a wealth-growing economy, we could do it. We're currently choosing not to as a nation, and that is why at the moment 2 leaders who believe might is right, the spheres of influence, are dominating the game. And until that happens, we'll just be supplicants to them all.
Sir Ben Wallace, former Defence Secretary of the United Kingdom, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Venetia, what's your final thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Dom. Well, I wanted to flag an article that our US reporter Cameron Henderson has written, which is up on the Telegraph website now and we'll link to in the show notes. Basically suggests that Trump taking Venezuela will have been welcomed by Russia because it aligns with a deal that they offered Trump during his first term. Cameron writes that speaking in 2019 to Congress, Fiona Hill, who you'll know as Donald Trump's Russia advisor until she was kicked out, she testified that the Russians were signalling very strongly that they wanted to somehow make some very strange swap arrangement between Venezuela and Ukraine. She likened Russia's proposal to the Monroe Doctrine, which is the 19th century policy under President James Monroe that sought to establish America's sphere of influence. She said to Congress, they were basically signalling, you have your Monroe Doctrine, you want us out of your backyard, well, we have our own version of this. You're in our backyard in Ukraine. Like I said, I'll link to that article in the show notes, but I think it gets into something that we have been covering on Battle Lines. We covered in our Monday episode that this spheres of influence idea is coming to dominate geopolitics. On the face of it, Trump's mission dealt a body blow to Putin. It cut Moscow off from its closest ally in the region in Venezuela and, of course, a source of oil revenues. Although, as Dom says, we'll see what's on that boat. But it's actually a boon for Putin. It plays into this idea that you do what you want in your backyard, I'll do what I want in my backyard. And this idea of the international law means nothing in the face of rule of force. So do listen to that episode if you have a chance. We look at the downsides and upsides of Trump's attack on Venezuela for Iran, Russia and China. Just search Battle Lines wherever you get your podcasts. Ooh.
Thank you, Venetia. Right, do tie in with us tomorrow. I think it's going to be, another consequential 24 hours. Jeez, strap in. But thank you for your company today. Thank you, Francis. He's had to dash off. He's gone back to do whatever he's doing in Budapest. Venetia, thank you for your company today. And thank you all for listening. We'll be back here, same time, same place tomorrow, 1 o'clock London time. I do hope you can join us. But from the Telegraph newspaper in London, I wish you all a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from the Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.